Today, I want to talk about Joe Rogan and this ongoing story with Spotify. Everyone's talking about it. Wasn't sure if I'm a little too late to the game. On the other hand, I feel like if I don't say anything about it, I might get some comments like, "Why aren't you talking about Joe Rogan and Spotify? Don't you care about cancel culture and censorship?" So let's get into it. First off, I want to reiterate, this is a point that I've made a lot when talking about big tech, is that these tech companies, especially ones that are in the business of content, entertainment, like Spotify, Netflix, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch. Did I already say Amazon? Doesn't matter. All of these companies exist to make money. These companies do not exist to serve the general welfare or the public good. They do not exist to serve the spirit of the First Amendment, whatever the fuck that means. They exist to make money, and they have every right to decide who gets to be on their platform. They get to decide what kind of speech, what kind of ideas are shared on their platform. For better or worse, that does not mean that they are beyond scrutiny. I think YouTube and Twitter especially have shitty standards when it comes to discussing COVID. When it comes to politics, they do not apply their vague standards fairly across the board. That's an entirely different discussion, because one thing I do want to get into, I just want to make that clear before I get into something I've noticed over the last year or so, is this troubling trend of government, particularly people in the White House, who have taken greater interest in what kind of ideas and information are shared on social media and companies like Spotify. Right here, this is from a few weeks ago. We have President jibber-jabbering Joe Biden, who made this special plea. He said, "I make a special appeal to social media companies and media outlets. Please deal with the misinformation and disinformation that's on your shows. It has to stop."
Blow it out your ass.
And I think Joe Biden can fuck right off with that attitude. I've also read stories, this is from the Daily Wire, about how the Biden Surgeon General suggests Joe Rogan podcast should be censored. Not sure if this is a little overblown when you get down to the quote. Apparently, he says, this is not just about what the government can do. He said, this is about what companies and individuals recognizing that the only way we get past misinformation is if we are careful about what we say and use the power that we have to limit the spread of misinformation.
Blow it out your ass.
And then we had Jen Psaki recently talk about how she said, our hope is that all major tech platforms and all major news sources, for that matter, be responsible and be vigilant to ensure that the American people have access to accurate information on something as significant as COVID-19. Now, it's bad enough that people like Joe Biden and Jen Psaki and the Surgeon General are taking this great interest in private businesses, when it should not be the business of the President of the United States to give advice, to make appeals to how companies run their business. That's bad enough. But if you remember, last July, it was reported that Jen Psaki was talking about how White House officials are working with companies like Facebook to flag misinformation. Here's a short video clip on it.
In terms of actions, Alex, that we have taken, or we're working to take, I should say, from the federal government, we've increased disinformation research and tracking within the Surgeon General's office. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook.
The federal government are flagging problematic posts for Facebook.
No offense, but it sounds like some fucking commie gobbledygook.
That spread disinformation. We're working with doctors and medical professionals to connect to connected medical experts who are popular with their audiences with accurate information and boost trusted content. So we're helping get trusted content out there. We also created the COVID Community Corps to get factual information into the hands of local messengers. And we're also investing, as you all have seen, in the president's, the vice president's, and Dr. Fauci's time.
Now, there was speculation at the time. I don't know if this is just Jen Psaki misspeaking. Maybe she's saying the quiet part out loud. It's hard to tell if companies like Facebook went to the federal government saying stuff like, hey, what are your experts saying so we can better know how to moderate our content? Don't know if that's going on. There was speculation at the time that maybe, again, this is speculation. I want to be clear about that. There was speculation that maybe officials in the White House and the Biden administration were threatening these companies with political pressure, like antitrust litigation, maybe some tax audits or whatever. They were threatening these companies if they did not listen to their moderation suggestions. And I think there should be an investigation into stuff like this. I think this is very serious stuff. The White House should not be trying to tell companies how to moderate content. And if it turns out that the Biden administration, including Biden himself, members of the Biden administration were threatening companies like Facebook behind the scenes with political pressure, with consequences, then those members should be fired, including Biden himself. If it turns out that Biden was threatening these companies, then President Biden should be impeached and removed from office. I think we're getting into very dangerous territory when the federal government, the commander-in-chief, gets in the business of deciding what's true, what's not true, what's misinformation, what's not information, and we're also going to put pressure on private companies and punish them if they do not enforce our misinformation standards. Even if you could say that, Jen Psaki, like, oh, they were just going after bad information, and let's just assume that Facebook, all they got rid of was misinformation. That's none of the fucking government's business. So this all brings me to Joe Rogan. I want to talk a lot about Joe Rogan. I first found out about Joe Rogan. I first became familiar with him when he played a character on this show, News Radio. I watched this show when it reran late night on Fox when I was a teenager. Joe Rogan actually played a handyman at a radio station named Joe. He kind of plays himself in this show. There's even an episode where he talks about how the moon landing was fake. But oddly enough, there's an episode of News Radio where Joe the handyman, he gets thrown on the air. One of the hosts at this fictional radio station, Bill McNeil, who's played by Phil Hartman, decides to throw Joe on the air kind of as a joke while his co-host is out sick in the show. And Joe it turns out that Joe has a natural talent for radio to the point where everyone loves him. And this ends up backfiring on Bill McNeil, who suddenly becomes threatened by Joe's talent to the point where he demands that the station take him off the air.
I just wanted to apologize to you. I shouldn't have put Joe in the booth.
Oh, no need to apologize. Joe's doing great.
I put Joe on the air because I didn't want anyone any better to get that much airtime. I thought Joe would make me look good. At any rate, I've learned a valuable lesson.
Good.
And I apologize.
Good.
Now get him off the air.
No.
Why not?
Because he's good.
Who would have known this episode would have been so foreshadowing of what or at least somewhat foreshadowing of what's going on today with Joe Rogan. And yeah, some people in the chat are saying, oh, I first found out about Joe Rogan because of Fear Factor. Well, before he got onto Fear Factor, I became more familiar with Joe Rogan when he took over The Man Show with Doug Stanhope, which is another interesting odd foreshadowing because they took over the show from Adam Carolla and Jimmy Kimmel. This was Adam Carolla and Jimmy Kimmel's. Jimmy Kimmel, this was the second show he had. He used to do Win Ben Stein's Money. But who would have thought that when these guys did The Man Show, Jimmy Kimmel would go on to host one of the popular late night shows on broadcast television on ABC to compete with The Tonight Show and The Late Show. Well, Adam Carolla would go on to host the most popular podcast in the world at the time. Then it eventually got taken over by Joe Rogan in terms of popularity. But yeah, now Jimmy Kimmel, now he's known for going on his late night show and crying every time a healthcare policy doesn't go his way. Adam Carolla has become one of the bigger names in right-wing talk. And then Joe Rogan and Doug Stanhope took over The Man Show. Then Joe Rogan eventually went on to host Fear Factor, as was mentioned in the chat. Joe Rogan surfaced again when he called out Carlos Mencia. I think that was in 2007 or 2008. I always thought that this incident was a good case study in integrity, because Carlos Mencia was known for stealing jokes, stealing material. And when Joe Rogan called him out on it, he had a falling out with his agency, the Comedy Store, where this whole feud was went down. The Comedy Store, I guess, picked Carlos Mencia over Joe Rogan, and Rogan didn't perform at the Comedy Store for years. And he had a falling out with his agency. His agency also represented Carlos Mencia, and they demanded that Joe apologize to Carlos Mencia, and Rogan was like, no, I'm not going to do that. So at the time, when Carlos Mencia was a much bigger name, one could easily conclude, wow, Rogan is throwing his entire career down the drain over this feud with Carlos Mencia. He's getting dropped by his agency. Major comedy clubs are choosing to not book him. And then you fast forward 5 years later, Joe Rogan is one of the biggest names in comedy. He's selling out theaters. Meanwhile, Carlos Mencia is kind of past his prime at this point. Maybe not his prime, but his peak in popularity. And then Rogan, as we know, he ended up doing his own podcast, which ended up becoming one of the biggest podcasts in the world, to the point where he got a $100 million deal from Spotify. And now it's 2022, and a lot of people are upset with Joe Rogan because he talks to a lot of problematic guests. He has some not so popular views when it comes to COVID and vaccines and other political topics. But I think a lot of people are missing the appeal of Joe Rogan. And I think his main appeal is genuine curiosity and diversity of guests. And it's not just about politics, although I think you could easily play it both ways when it comes to Joe Rogan. You know, a conservative could look at Rogan's guests like Bernie Sanders, like Tulsi Gabbard, like Cornel West, like Jimmy Dore, like Kyle Kulinski, and complain about how Rogan, he's just a left-wing shill who's pushing for more socialism with all of these socialist guests and his desire to have socialized medicine in the United States. Meanwhile, someone on the left, and I've seen a lot of this sentiment from the left, they'll point to some of Rogan's conservatives and IDW guests like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and Steven Crowder and James Lindsay and Dan Crenshaw. Remember Hassan Piker's America Deserved 9/11 incident? That took place when he was responding to one of the Dan Crenshaw episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience. Someone could look at that and say, Rogan, he's some crazy conspiracy crank who loves guns and the Second Amendment and he's just a meathead who's trying to promote right-wingers with his views on guns and cancel culture and transgender issues. And there is a part of me that sympathizes with this criticism that a lot of his guests are problematic. One of the notable examples that's often invoked is Alex Jones. Joe Rogan has had other guests that I really don't like. One of them is Abby Martin, who is a journalist who has a history of working for state media in adversarial nations of the United States like Venezuela and Russia. I think you could say Jimmy Dore has kind of reached a point of, kind of cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. But what can you really do about that? Other than call it out when you see it. I mean, are we going to start taking down every talk show that has a problematic guest on?
Yeah, to the no, yeah, to the no, to the no, no, no.
You could probably say the same thing about other famous talk shows like Larry King. You could probably say this about Phil Donahue. On one hand, Phil Donahue would have awesome guests like Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand.
And then on other shows, Donahue would have on Scum of the Earth like Noam Chomsky. If anything, one could say showcasing such guests should serve as an opportunity for better people to discuss why these guests are scum of the earth and have a conversation about it. I think one of the major appeals of the Joe Rogan experience is the diversity of guests, even aside from politics. You know, he has all sorts of guests on that have mainstream appeal, that have high interests like comedians, MMA fighters, musicians, scientists, authors, historians, actors, business leaders. And I think this is a huge reason why Rogan has broad appeal. I myself, I don't listen to all of his shows. It's very hard to keep up with him with the amount of content he puts out. Usually when I do, it's because there's a guest I'm interested in. A recent example of that is Carrot Top. I found his episode with Carrot Top very interesting. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm guessing that most people that download an episode of Joe Rogan, they're not looking for political commentary or much less medical advice. And considering all of this, that the diversity of guests and the fact that Rogan has millions of viewers, odds are he says a lot of stuff that all of his guests, his millions and millions of guests, disagree with. You know, it's not like every listener of Rogan is some mindless zombie just listening like, Rogan's guess that the mRNA vaccine's bad. So if I get COVID, I'm just gonna take some ivermectin. People, when they criticize Rogan, they talk as if there's this assumption that all of his listeners are just mindless zombies that just go along with everything he says, including a lot of the wacky ideas that are expressed on his show. And if we're assuming that the general public are just a bunch of mindless zombies that just gullibly believe in any piece of misinformation that finds its way into their thick skulls, then I think we have much bigger problems that won't be solved by Spotify removing a fucking podcast. Although, ironically enough, I think I'm sure a lot of the hysterical critics of Rogan probably wish that most of society were just a bunch of mindless zombies who follow government regulators and bureaucrats and experts with equal blind gullibility. You also have to consider, you also have to consider that many podcasts in general are consumed in the background. It's not like Rogan's listeners are just opening up their Spotify app thinking, all right, time to get my only source of information for today, which is whatever Joe Rogan and his guests are going to spoon feed me. I think a lot of people just put this, not that they don't absorb it, but they put it on in the background while they're driving, while they're doing chores around the house or working out or whatever. And I think another underappreciated aspect of Rogan is that he is a good interviewer and he's really good at holding conversations. A lot of the questions he asks are out of genuine curiosity. You do not get this sense that Rogan is out looking for some gotcha question or has some agenda when he asks these questions. And I think this is a very underappreciated talent, being able to hold a 2 to 3 hour conversation, natural conversation, with someone without scripts or a laundry list of questions or some agenda of topics. Not only asking good, genuine questions, but also having, Rogan has his own wealth of general knowledge to share and the comedic chops to keep the show entertaining. You might be able to say that some of Rogan's audience goes to him for some of the wacky ideas and wacky guests, but I don't think I'm just speculating. I don't think that's a significant portion of his audience. Which some may ask, what should be done about Joe Rogan? I think that people are just going to have to deal with Joe Rogan and his podcast for better or worse. I don't know the details of Rogan's deal with Spotify other than the reported $100 million contract. Another piece of media that reminds me of this whole situation between Rogan and Spotify and in the recent reports of Joni Mitchell and Neil Young leaving Spotify if they don't get rid of Joe Rogan, is the Howard Stern biopic Private Parts, which is a pretty good movie. If you have HBO, I recommend you watch it, but it's about the rise of Howard Stern. And there's a point where Howard Stern, he has a radio show in Washington, D.C., and the NBC radio station in New York discovers that a significant portion of their DC market has been taken away. And they find out that it's a result of this guy named Howard Stern. So then they eventually recruit Howard Stern to NBC in New York to be a radio show host in New York without knowing much about his show. And soon after Howard Stern arrives, they realize that he's very controversial, that he's on the FCC's most wanted list and is probably going to bring a lot of baggage, a lot of unwanted scrutiny from the FCC and the general public. And there's even a point where they're like, what do we do with this guy? It's going to cost us a lot of money to just fire him. We're going to have to pay him more than his contract's worth. How do we handle the situation? But there are a lot of people out there who think that Spotify should get rid of Joe Rogan. And again, I don't know if they would have to pay him out his entire contract or a significant portion, but that would be a lot of money for Spotify to eat. But let's play this through for a second. What will Spotify firing Joe Rogan accomplish exactly? If Spotify has to pay out Joe Rogan's $100 million contract to get rid of him, now you have hurt Spotify's ability to sustain itself and compete against other digital giants in music and podcasting like Apple and Amazon and Google. You know, everyone likes to shriek about big tech. Woo! Often talking about how these big tech companies are big scary monopolies with too much power, too much leverage over consumers and artists. Yet Spotify getting rid of Rogan could potentially put one of the main competitors in music out of business, at the very least make it extremely difficult for Spotify to compete going forward. Now, if you do that, if Spotify pays $100 million to get rid of Rogan to essentially compete with them, now Google, Apple, and Amazon have more leverage over consumers and artists.
Well done.
Meanwhile, Joe Rogan would get a big payday. Do you guys think that Joe Rogan is just going to go away after getting millions of dollars in free money?
Yeah, to the no, yeah, to the no, to the no, no, no.
Even if everyone else in this industry, like Apple and YouTube, if they decide to shut Joe Rogan out, With millions of dollars, Joe Rogan could probably launch his own hosting service, hire some software developers and engineers to program his own app, his own website, his own streaming platform, much like what his friend Alex Jones did. And if I'm recalling correctly, I think I remember Alex Jones mentioning on the Joe Rogan Experience that ever since he got chased off of all of the major social media platforms, that Alex Jones and InfoWars, they're doing better business than ever. They're making more money than ever. They developed their own streaming services. On top of that, Rogan would end up looking like a martyr. He would get tons of free publicity, and I think we're already seeing a Streisand effect with all of this controversy. The crazies that do like Rogan because of his wacky guests and crazy views would still find him, much like they did with Alex Jones and InfoWars after Alex Jones was chased off of every social media company. So all you might accomplish with Spotify getting rid of Rogan is some virtue signal platitude from Spotify to their own financial detriment as Joe Rogan laughs all the way to the bank. Now, part of me does wonder if there's any silver linings to all of this. It does look like Rogan has overwhelming support right now, even from people in the mainstream, like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He gave support to Rogan on his recent Instagram post. Even notable left-wing commentators like Jon Stewart and Trevor Noah have voiced support for Joe Rogan in this whole controversy. People keep making the point that Spotify stock has fallen off due to this whole controversy, recent controversy over the last few weeks surrounding Joe Rogan. Although if you actually look, Spotify has been on a decline since November 1st. Just been on a steady decline for the last 3 months. And according to the Wall Street Journal, tech stocks overall have been on a slump, especially Facebook the other day. So I'm not sure we can blame all of this on Joe Rogan and the controversy involving Spotify. We are already seeing a lot of virtue signaling from people that are deleting Spotify in favor of Apple Music. Okay, have fun with that, I guess. That being said, I think it will be interesting to see where all of this goes and what impact this will have on cancel culture. Maybe Spotify standing behind Joe Rogan is a signal that cancel culture is on its way for a temporary, if not permanent, defeat. At the very least, it might die down for a while. It's been said that maybe this is the beginning of a new trend, considering that Netflix stood behind Dave Chappelle despite controversy surrounding his latest special and a lot of public pushback against Dave Chappelle. Substack recently announced that they're not going to make content moderation decisions based on public pressure or PR considerations. And now Spotify is sticking with their guns with Joe Rogan. So I think we are going to end up seeing if all of this hoopla, all of this shrieking is going to have an impact on the bottom line of companies like Netflix, Spotify, and maybe even Substack. And if we find out that Netflix and Spotify experience little to no financial consequences, then maybe other companies and the culture at large will recognize that these cancel culture mobs are just a bunch of loud, obnoxious, yapping lapdogs with no bites rather than a vicious pack of wolves.